Florida State fans have big expectations for this defense to take another leap under defensive coordinator Adam Fuller this year. We're talking with ESPN's David Hale about that defense. And David, we'll jump right into it. We're going to start up front. You came out with your rankings not too long ago. You've been going through all of the position groups for the different teams in the ACC. And I know a lot of people yell at you for rankings, but Florida State fans, I think, are going to be pretty happy when they go through the threads that you've got. But this is the first time in a long time, maybe 2013, 2014, that a lot of people, or maybe just you, have Florida State over Clemson in the ACC on the defensive line. I think Florida State fans have been saying that and believe that. But there's some garnet and gold colored glasses on when fans say that. But talk to us about FSU's defensive line.
Yeah, it's probably a toss-up depending on the vantage point you want to look at. Clemson has some very talented guys at the top, but they're not very experienced in terms of depth. And a couple of the guys that they've got, Tyler Davis and Xavier Thomas, who they expect to play, Justin Maskell for that matter too, that they expect to play a big role, have been injured a lot in recent years. So I just look at Clemson and I say, yeah, if those four guys are out there, great. But how often will we actually see those four guys out there? Florida State runs into a little bit of the same concern. And certainly if you look at where the issues were last year, particularly with the run defense, so much of that came down to not being particularly healthy on the D-line and particularly at defensive tackle and particularly Fabian Lovett. I will completely forget the numbers, so I won't even begin to try to guess at it. But in going through the numbers last year, in the handful of snaps that Fabian Lovett was on the field, which I think represented something like about a quarter of FSU's defensive snaps on the year, the run defense was really good. And when he wasn't on the field, which was about 3/4 of the time, the run defense was really bad. That's, the short way of saying it. So are they deeper this year than they were last year? Yeah, I think unquestionably so on the D-line. The transfers that they brought in, I think, are really good, should be both good fits for what they need and be able to play and contribute immediately. I look at all that and I'd say, maybe the high end, top end is if everything works out for Clemson, maybe a smidge higher. But I think the safer bet is probably Florida State at this point. So that's why I had them ranked that way. And again, to your point, and you could probably say this on both sides of the line of scrimmage, when's the last time we could really say this about Florida State, that they had the absolute beast at the line of scrimmage to go out and make it happen? And I think they definitely do this year.
I want to follow up on Fabian Lovett there because, yes, when he was in the lineup, Florida State's defense was pretty – what they did against the run was pretty spectacular. And then when he wasn't, they were not great. That said, do you think there's maybe a little bit of who they played in that stretch as well that could factor in? Would Wake still have had fairly good success? Would Clemson still have had fairly good success? He got to go up against some offenses that were pretty putrid down the stretch. So just thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, it's hard to separate. And this is always you start dealing with the stats in college football and you always run into the sample size problem. And I think that's true to some degree. They probably weren't as good as the numbers looked with Lovett or as bad without. I think those probably – I just think unquestionably they would have been better to have Fabian Lovett in some of those games. And they probably would have been worse without him even against some lesser competition. But look, at the end of the day, if they want to beat Clemson this year, they got to do something about Clemson's run game. That's just a fact. If they want to beat LSU, they can't have Jaden Daniels do to them what he did to them last year, or a lot of what we saw Dylan Gabriel doing too. They have to win the line of scrimmage on defense. And, there were some games last year that they narrowly pulled out and a couple that they lost where they just did not win the line of scrimmage there.
When you look at the second level, you have this flipped. You have Clemson and then a little bit of a gap and then FSU. Bethune and Deloach did a great job last year. Obviously, Florida State bringing both of them back is really big, but just not a ton of depth. DJ Lundy was in there and did a fairly good job. Not a ton of depth at the linebacker unit. Is that where you think Clemson has the bit of an advantage there?
Yeah, they've got a good bit of depth at linebacker, and then more, I think the high end for their two starters, Trotter Jr. and Barrett Carter are both really, really good. Wade Woodaz got in a good bit of time the last 5 or so games of the year last year and played really well. I think that's Clemson's strength is linebacker, I think, this year. How much they build around that. It's fascinating because Brent Venables was a linebackers coach. I think that was always where he wanted his guy. He had a very distinct vision for what he wanted his linebackers to look like. But the one year in which it was truly a linebacker driven defense, which was the Isaiah Simmons year before he got drafted, like whatever, number 4 overall. I was probably the weakest defense that Venables had there in his time. And then how is that going to translate to what the defense looks like now post Brent Venables? I don't know. I found the defense to be kind of uninspiring last year at Clemson in general. Um, is that a function of injuries? Is it a function of first year with new defensive coaching staff? Is it a function of maybe that coaching staff is not what Brent Venables was? I think there's probably a little bit of all three mixed into that. Whereas with Florida State, the one thing you can say is this is a very veteran group of linebackers, the guys, at least the front line that they're going to run out there. How much you get out of that, I think health obviously comes down to it. I mean, I think if they wanted to play that trio of those three guys the vast majority of the snaps, I mean, you can get away with that if they stay healthy. And I think they'll be pretty good if that's the case.
All right, we'll get back to talking with David in just a moment, but of course, I want to give some love to our friends over at Garnet and Gold. Listen, season is just around the corner. I hate to be cliche with that, but we are under 50 days away, and you guys have been buying up these jerseys that we're showing on screen like crazy. If you haven't got your coach's polo, the new Nike shoes that are coming soon, the Columbia stuff, whatever you need for season, getting down to the wire. Go to garnetandgold.com, use code NOSLAW for 15% off. You should not be shopping anywhere else. Great prices. We're going to save you a little bit of money. The best customer service, and they are the last family-owned and operated FSU retailer in Tallahassee. Make sure that you're shopping at garnetandgold.com and nowhere else. So looking at the back end, again, probably been a little while since we can say this. Florida State's always done a fairly good job at defensive back, but still to be potentially top of the conference. Obviously bringing in Cypress. They need to figure out a way to replace Jamie Robinson. And eat up some of the snaps that he had. But I think they like what they have at the top with Shaheem Brown and Akeem Dent. But bringing in Cypress, Jones, and Green kind of, emerging at the end of last year. A lot of people think, within the Florida State community that Cypress wouldn't even be the starter today if we were playing LSU, but about 50 days to go. So we'll see how that kind of shakes out. Clemson down at 4. I know that we've kind of focused on just FSU and Clemson in this, but thoughts on the Noles having the best defensive backfield in the ACC? Again, probably been a while since we could say that.
Yeah, it's funny. That was, I think, my first set of rankings that I put out, and I think it's a tribute to how far FSU has come. That the fan base not only isn't yelling at me about stuff, but they're like, you might be a little too high on our secondary. So that's I think that's a good sign. Look, I think there's the problem is I'm not sure that there's somebody distinctly better than what Florida State is. I get, particularly at safety, that there's some maybe depth concerns. I don't know. Dion decided to take like half of the safeties off the roster. I'm not sure how much those half of the safeties would have played anyway. I think probably they are more, again, we can't ignore health. Health is always going to be a key, and they've got to stay healthy because once you start digging into that depth, I think there are more question marks, but that's true of everybody. I mean, this is the age of the portal. I don't think you build a lot of experience depth anywhere anymore. So I look at it and look, I've heard the conversations about Cypress too, and maybe he doesn't start. If that's the case, though, that's a real good sign for FSU's corners because I talked to coaches around the league who played Virginia last year and thought he was not just good, but maybe the best player available in the transfer portal this offseason. So, look, I get that there might be some, growing pains, adjustments to a new scheme, adjustments to a new team. Maybe things were overvalued a little bit because he was facing some bad coastal quarterbacks. Hard to say all of that, but I think, again, if he's your number 3 corner, you're in pretty good shape overall.
Yeah. All right, let's finish here. Is Jared Verse your defensive player of the year this year? I don't know if you put that out yet or not, but if you had to pick one, or have you already voted on it, is he your defensive MVP?
Yeah, my colleague Andrea Adelson, I think, debated this briefly at some point earlier in the offseason, and she had dibs on Verse because like he's her favorite. She's writing a story on him, or did write a story on him. I don't know. I don't read anything that ESPN puts out these days. I'm just kidding about that. I'm just kidding. Please read. I would say you'd be foolish not to think he is the preseason defensive player of the year. It makes a ton of sense. I will say those two linebackers at Clemson warrant being in that conversation. I'm sure we'll see a few others. Peyton Wilson at NC State's probably a guy worth considering as well. But just given the ridiculously high ceiling for Jared Verse, it's hard not to put him at the top. Again, we will come down to talking about health because he didn't stay on the field through the whole season last year, and he played a few games where he was probably not at his best. It is a credit to him that he still looked that good while probably not at 100% for a good chunk of the season.
When it's all said and done, FSU probably, if I just look at your rankings, probably has the best defense in the league this year, preseason, heading into it. Are they a top 10 defense in college football this year? If you're a betting man right now.
Again, I think it comes down to the run defense for me, and I think, again, particularly I want to see them corral the quarterbacks a little bit better than they did last year because there were games that it was just very frustrating to see them, even when it wasn't necessarily a big play that came out of a quarterback scramble or something like that. Though Jaden Daniels, I mean, that the fourth quarter from him was entirely the only reason LSU was even in that game. There was enough plays against Clemson, I think certainly Dylan Gabriel against from Oklahoma, that you just look and you're like, they had him down in the backfield. They had a sack. They had a game-changing defensive play that didn't come through, and it turned into maybe nothing, maybe just an incomplete pass, but it took away something that might have been a game changer. So I want to see not even necessarily the consistency, because I think the consistency should be there. I'll be surprised if they're not consistently pretty good. I want them to finish those great plays, and particularly when it comes to the run defense.
I appreciate ESPN's David Hale for joining me today. In our very next video, we are going to do the same thing and break down Florida State's offense. So make sure that you're subscribed and you don't miss it. If you want to get caught on the very latest with FSU football, click right here to do so.